All right, so we're recording now. Should see a little red dot. All right. So, grand risings, everyone. Welcome to the first three-part series of discussions. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you to Anna, the False Youth in Action team, for inviting me to host this discussion with you all. And you know, for today's discussion, I really want to start off with this quote from Dorothy Roberts, who's a professor of law in sociology, where she says, if you came with no preconceptions about the purpose of the child welfare systems, you would have to conclude it is a system designed to regulate poor families of color. And I often start with this quote because it really grounds me in remembering who we're talking about, what we're talking about, and the communities that we're talking about. And I guess I will make as a quick housekeeping note, this presentation is, like, I actually shared the link in the chat. So if you don't want to watch it on your screen, you can watch, like, this link, I'm following it, it's going to be alive. You can use the link to watch if you're having trouble seeing the screen, pull it up on your phone or what so have you. So that's, I use that just to set the stage of where we are and what this kind of child welfare system and these different institutions, what they're really designed to do, right? We as people work within these systems at whichever level, as advocates, as organizers, as people who are impacted by systems, as change agents within the system. But we must remember, like, if you don't hold on to what you think you want to do, which is change the system, we must also remember we're holding true the kind of surveillance of Black and brown bodies. So that's kind of just setting the framework of today's conversation. Lots of people on here I know some of you as well, and you all probably know me. But you know, I love this. I always share this with folks. It's something I wrote a while back. And it said, you know, I talked about, as a child growing up in Compton, I challenged everything that I saw as unjust. My foster mom would tell me that I would be president, and no one had ever suggested I was capable of achieving something like that. And it stuck in my mind like an earworm. I discovered how my voice was essential in building an equitable and just society. And now every day I wake up fighting for Black children, just much like me, to have a fair chance at opportunity to thrive. Because I too see the president in every system impacted kid in Los Angeles. And that's really the world at large now. And I always share this because I think through this idea of really achieving our greatest desires. As someone impacted by the foster care system, impacted by justice systems, both directly and indirectly through community members and family members, you know, I really think through and hold on to the idea that it is my duty to fight every single day. And just as you all, as members of False Youth in Action, whether directly or through other kind of connected organizations, or even just simply being here today, I think that you all too, at some level, hold true to that idea of the duty is to fight for other young people who are system impacted. Bird's eye view here is my CV, just because people care about that these days. I have a doctorate in leadership for change from Field and Graduate University, class of 2019. Woo. Currently, I serve as an associate director of managed organizations at Arabella Advisors on the East Coast here in DC, although I live in Baltimore now. Previously, I was at Liberty Hill Foundation and a bunch of other stuff. So my CV speaks for itself. You all can go on LinkedIn and find that if that's what you care about. So the meat of today's discussion. So as you all saw, this is a three-part series. They build off of each other. You're not required to attend all three. However, they do build off of each other. This first session, we're talking about a Black perspective on the history of foster care. And really, we're looking at really a historical account really today. So where were we historically? And kind of let's understand and unpack a more nuanced perspective of child welfare, of its history. In particular, we're going to be critiquing the idea of foster care starting with a white child. Feel free to drop that white child's name in the chat if you think you know that person's name. We're going to give it a second to see if anyone actually is going to make a guess. Let's see. No guesses yet. That's all good. All right, so we got Mary. Close. We'll talk about Mary. Benjamin Eaton. So looking at this from this, I call it the anglicized perspective of foster care. And I call it the anglicized perspective because it's really the dominant narrative of what foster care is, who it was for, and the system that were set up to protect people, right? So we talked about this guy, Benjamin Eaton, who was the son of Francis and Christian Eaton, and he was bound out. That's what they called indentured servitude. So if you ever see an old text where it says bound out, we're talking about indentured servitude. And then the indentured servitude is also a euphemism for enslavement. So basically, interestingly about this guy, Benjamin Eaton, his father, Francis, was actually on the Mayflower. So dad died, and then he, as often in the case in the early 1600s and throughout the 17th century, you had folks who were poor, whose parents had passed on or whatever reason. They would often be kind of bound out to other families who would take care of them until they reached the age of majority, or usually like sometime really around like 16 years, but depending on what the circumstances were, often longer. So we talked about that. So we talked about this idea of indentured servitude and what it really means to like be a foster kid, right? From this, again, and let's remember we're in this anglicized perspective of foster care. So we know that moving forward into the kind of really the mid-19th century, we had over 30,000 kids who were homeless and neglected, who lived on New York City streets. These are largely white kids who, and it was less about being neglected from really like system leaders' perspective and more about vagrants, more about like troubles to society, more about issues. Lots of the same language and things that we hear about today, right, in a modern context, some 400 years later, right? It's about how do you keep kids out of trouble and out of delinquency, right? We hear that all the time. Oh, we don't want them to become delinquent. And so here in 1853 is when Charles Loring Brace founded one of the Children's Aid Societies. They all started popping up throughout the country / colonies and territories. Because remember, we're still in the 1800s. So at that time, you know, California wasn't a U.S. state, but it was still a territory. And so throughout kind of the modern, what would have been the contemporary kind of Americas, you had these Children's Aid Society, largely religious, who basically were shipping kids off to the Midwest usually, right? As folks were moving out west, they needed help on their farms. And they'd say, hey, we'll take this kid who can help us on our farm, and in return, we'll provide them food, clothing, shelter at the bare minimum amount. Unlike, not unlike stories that we hear today around like kids who are in care, right? Who we hear stories about, working and doing things for the family and free labor and, watching their biological children and all of those things, right? So that's kind of the essence of the Orphan Training movement. I'm sure most folks on this call have heard this story already. Cool. Anyone ever heard of this kind of phrase before? No. De hominem levigatim? No. All right. It's basically, it is the precursor to a writ of habeas corpus. Anyone familiar with a writ of habeas corpus? It literally basically translates to produce the body. So here I bring this up because someone mentioned young Mary Ellen, who in 1974, who's pictured here, was severely beaten and all of these things. And essentially, as the story is usually told, is that we had to use animal laws to protect Mary Ellen, and then kind of that's how she entered this kind of contemporary context of foster care. And so I always talk about Mary Ellen in the context of that's wrong. One of the people who happened to take on advocating for her was an advocate for the Association of the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. But there was no law on the books that was like protecting animals and then later applied to children. In essence, there were people who were animal rights activists who had joined forces with other religious leaders to protect Mary and other children. And this happened because at the time, we're talking about the late 19th century, is that property rights were very important, and the courts were very much out of the family's business, right? And so there, even as recently as the turn of the 21st century, courts routinely said it is not the U.S. government's duty to intervene in the lives of private citizens, specifically familial kind of relations. And so what happened here was they kind of filed this writ, which was said, okay, let's just produce the body, meaning bring her forth to court. And that's the same thing that happens with contemporary writs of habeas corpus. So it was upon having this young girl who was about 10 at the time being produced in court, and her testimony, right? And seeing the scars, as you can see in this image, the scars on her legs, the bruises, and things of that nature, that really resulted in her being kind of freed from this adoptive family, which was also ironic, is that like she was adopted but stolen and not really, it wasn't a above board, so to speak, adoption. She was basically kidnapped and illegally adopted and then severely beaten. So I bring this up because it's really important for us to have a contextual understanding of what we're usually told, right? We're usually told that, you have Charles Loring Brace, the Children's Aid Society, you have Mary Ellen, who are all white people who were just poor little kids who were brought into a system and protected. And it's like, actually, that's not necessarily the case. They're much more complex, it's much more nuanced. And so for today's discussion, I really want us to really like hold on to like this, put it in our left hand, right? And then for the second part of today's discussion, we're going to talk about kind of what was happening literally simultaneous to all of these things happening up until really the late 1950s for Black people as it relates to care. And so I think that's the last slide before I ask for a question. Let me see. So again, we've talked a little bit about this already. This, idea of the Orphan Training movement, these children's aid societies really just shipping kids out west, and this idea of like manifest destiny and building out west, take the kids off the streets, right? And so it wasn't until the turn of the 20th century, which would have been 1900s, where states really began to address the needs of the child. And I think we should probably put like air quotes around needs there. It's like before it was about how do you get kids off the streets, no matter what happens to them, let's get them off the streets. Like literally it would off the streets, don't care, out of sight, out of mind, right? And so then it was around the kind of turn of the 20th century where we really started to see kind of movement happening at the federal level, mostly with advocates pushing to like, all right, well, how do we care for children as opposed to just like not seeing kids that are a nuisance to us. So that's when you had a series of about 4 kind of White House conferences on the status of children. You had the Children's Bureau was established. You had the White House Conference on Child Welfare Standards. And then also at that kind of time, you also had the first juvenile court. And a lot of these juvenile courts still exist, right? And then so in places like Los Angeles, where a few folks are calling in from, you have the juvenile court is split into dependency and delinquency. In other parts of the country, it's a singular court. I mean, then yet still in other parts of the country, you still just have singular family courts that handle all juvenile delinquency, dependency just issues at large. And then, so if you think about the Social Security Act, we know even still today, most child welfare is funded through Title 4E of the Social Security Act. But it was 1935, it was signed into law with Children's Bureau leaders really advocating for it, who really drafted key sections that really gave the Children's Bureau ultimate responsibility for maternal and child health services, medical care for, they would say crippled children, but it's, you know, those who suffer disabilities, and then child welfare services. And then in a modern context, you add in a few other layers within the alphabet soup, the Administration for Children and Families, Administration for Children, Youth and Families, which are a part of this larger Children's Bureau. So it's, you know, as you see, you go from, you know, 1600, this idea of just like indentured servitude, someone take this kid and do whatever you want with them, but I can't take them, to really starting to say, all right, well, how do we care for not just the like physical needs, but also like the mental health needs, the medical needs, and all around kind of child kind of needs, right? And then we move to like this separate context of kind of like Black folks at the same time. And so before we move there, I really want to hear like some discussion, if we can, kind of like around this anglicized context of child welfare, and what do we think is missing, right? I did like a very high level of this anglicized context because it's not really the point of the conversation. It's written everywhere for you to find. But I love to hear what like thoughts are. Is this brand new information to folks? Have folks already been like, oh yeah, I knew that was wrong to begin with? Just what thoughts come to mind related to that, what we just talked about? And feel free to just kind of unmute yourself, and we'll try it that way.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, yes, so I definitely am really excited about this. This is Angela, and I feel like I've definitely been doing a lot of this research and stuff. I first learned about it a couple years ago, and I really started, you know, trying to ask that question: what was happening to the Black people? What was happening to the Indigenous people? What was happening, you know, in that whole respect? So I'm really excited to see, you know, more of what you've uncovered in all of that. But so far, I feel like, yes, this information is extremely important, and I have been getting into it, but I'm sure there's several things that I, you know, didn't get to. So I'm excited to learn and be here and absorb as much as I can. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Angela. I'm loving the virtual background. I'm assuming it's virtual because I'd love to be on the beach. Cool, thank you. Anyone else want to kind of offer just brief comments before we move to the next stage?
Yeah, it's just a comment. This is Aiden Flowers, pronouns he, him, they, them. It's just profound to me. Like, you know, as you were speaking about everything, some of the stuff that comes to my mind is like, who is, you know, when all of these different societies was coming together to address the need, like, I'm just thinking like, who's in the room? What are the intentions? Like, what were the true intentions behind all of this? When, like, you know, Anala just said, like, there are Black and brown and Indigenous folks that were children that were also struggling. So, and we know in that time, like, that was not a priority. So I'm just curious too, as we continue to go along, like, what more gets uncovered with like the intentions behind all of the things that we understand in the child
Right.
services today.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, no. Thank you so much, Aiden. And I think, what you bring up, what both Aiden and Angela bring up are really, really crucial. And it's one of the things that I always ask folks is who else was in the room? When you're getting a historical account of something, right? Especially it's like they talk about, it's like we talk about someone like Eaton, right? It's just like, all right, great. Like he went into what, they call it foster care. It's like, well, what else was happening in the 1600s to children, right? It's, you talk about Mary Ellen. It's like, okay, but what about the other children? What was going on with those folks? And, so it's like, and for us, it's always important to ask the question, who else was in the room? And so one last chance for comments before we move on to this next section.
I'm gonna chime in, but I gotta move because my dad's over here blending something in the kitchen. So I know we learned, at least, hi everyone, my name is Ashley, sorry, should introduce myself. Like throughout, just educationally, we learn about Mary Ellen, we learn about the white side of child welfare, but we never learn about the Black, POC, Indigenous side, because the government, the local municipalities are the ones that are perpetuating harm on these communities. So why address, child welfare system addresses the harm that white people, or the abuse, the neglect that white children, white families are going through, and try to address it in that way to uphold white family values. But when we come into talking about Black, Indigenous, and brown children, child welfare, that conversation, we're not in it because we're in state sanctioned harm and abuse that the government upholds. Child welfare is very much white and upholds these white family values. So, historically, we're not in this picture because we're not seen as, it's just, we're not seen of as the same importance as white children, as these white family values. Our cultural and traditional values are not the same as white family values, as Western perspectives of parenting, of, all this other cultural and traditional stuff. So I think it's interesting that you bring that up, and I'm glad you didn't bring it up with Mary Ellen, because, if you do an MSW, they'll tell you it started off with animal rights, it started off with Mary Ellen and this woman that came to save her. But we know that child welfare started way back when with slavery and children and all of that in plantation. So excited to learn more. It's nice to see you too.
Yeah, I could just pass it off to you, Ashley. No. No, you're right on, right? It is really interesting. I don't have an MSW, as you all know, but I think it's super interesting, this idea like that's literally like the idea that that's codified into curricula across the country. It's like, here is the narrative. However, if you think about kind of how history is taught and how history is rewritten throughout, the entire kind of timeline from primary school, secondary school, through post-secondary and postgraduate, it then becomes no surprise that the history that is told is like one side of like, of an exaggerated, right? Like, it's like this idea of like, often they say like the best lies are rooted in some truth, right? So it's like this idea of Mary Ellen. It's like, well, there was some truth to the idea of folks associated with the Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals being connected to her, right? But not in the way that it sounds better to say that they use animal rights laws to protect her, as opposed to people who were protecting animals who were also protecting humans. Doesn't sound as cool, doesn't sound as a memorable, catchy story to keep, through all MSW programs across the country. So moving forward, we're going to kind of shift to exactly what you're talking about, Ashley. So thank you to Ashley, Anela, and Aiden for sharing. So for this next section, I'm fingers crossed that, Anna, you pressed the button that said share audio as well when you shared your screen. So we'll see what happens here. Okay. So I don't think you did.
Yeah, let me. Okay. Share computer.
So if you just reshare your screen.
All right. Oh, just 1 second.
So it should be working now.
Should be working now. Let's try.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh. No, we lost you.
Oh, you lost me altogether?
Well, I mean, the video is not playing, or at least it's just not playing on my.
Yeah, it's rotating. If I can look it up by link and then share it from the YouTube directly.
Maybe one is, let's try resharing, because there's like a little button that says share computer audio. Like when you launch the Chrome tab, it's literally at the bottom left-hand corner. So, all right, let's try it now.
I hit the.
No? Okay, well, we'll skip the video. It was cool, but it's not critical. So we'll move on. It's all right. The video is not critical.
Can you share the link in the chat and we can watch it later?
Yes, I can, except that I'm on my iPad and it's like embedded into this. But I will make sure to get the video shared with you all for sure. In essence, the essence of the video, it was Professor Roberts. It popped out on the press. I don't know what that meant. And so, yeah. So in essence, they were really just talking about the idea of this, of child separation as a matter of U.S. policy. It was in the context. Oh, you got it? Seems like you got it. Do you want to try to share, just play it then?
Yeah, I'll put, okay, let me. Sorry, buddy. Can you see?
Joining us now to take a closer look at this is Dorothy Roberts. She's a professor of law and sociology.
Is that working for everybody?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I'm gonna hit play and then not mute myself just for this part.
At the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Dorothy, thank you for being with us. This is a little bit of an aside from the main question about separating parents from their children at the border, but it is an opportunity for us to remember that before we claim what we claim about loving families and keeping everybody together, we, from a policy perspective in the United States, do not actually practice what we preach.
That's right. And I actually don't think it's that much of an aside, because what we're seeing at the border is the separation of parents from their children. That happens in the United States already, right, in our foster care system every single day. And in some communities, especially Black communities and Native American communities, it happens at astronomical rates. And that's a reflection of the way in which this country does not take care of families. The reason why so many children end up in foster care is because of poverty and the inability of many families to have the material resources they need. And instead of supporting them with those resources, the main policy in the United States is to take them away from their parents and put them in substitute care.
So we are actually used to this. And if we go back sociologically into our history, we have done this to the poor. We did it to slaves, right? We just decided that, that families were not important. It was a way to weaken people. You could actually separate families. So we've got some deep-rooted cultural understanding of families that is not shared by the rest of the world.
That's right. So not only is the United States very stingy when it comes to supports for families, like the Family and Medical Leave Act, subsidized child care, medical care, as you've mentioned, the United States also is an outlier among advanced developed countries, but also all countries in the world in terms of the numbers of parents it incarcerates. So if you look at the chances that a black child in America will have an incarcerated parent, and that is a form of family separation that's aggressively imposed by the state, there's no place in the entire world where parents are incarcerated at the rate that they are in the United States. So we're an outlier not only in the lack of supports, but also in the aggressive way in which vulnerable families are treated when they're unable to have the resources to take care of their children.
So you use an interesting word there, vulnerable, because if you are wealthy enough in America, some of these things don't apply. If you are wealthy enough, then the fact that your employer doesn't give you paid medical leave or paid maternity leave, it's okay, because you're rich.
That's absolutely right. That's the way, that's a key element of our family policy in the United States, which is if you're rich enough to have the resources to take care of your children, you're fine. But the way in which the U.S. government, that state governments and the federal government deals with families that don't have those resources, it's not to be generous and care for them and try to keep children and parents together. It's to act very aggressively to make.
Awesome. Thank you. So again, I wanted to share that kind of like as this kind of context of we're always talking about family separation. And I often talk about foster care as the separation of families. And, thinking about like, as they mentioned in this interview, it's like this idea, like the historical context of family separation, not as a matter of coincidence, but as a matter of kind of state sanctioned policies, right? And so there they mentioned, this idea of, enslaved people whose families were torn apart. And so in doing my research for this session, I came across this poem, and one of the lines in the poem read, "But the child was torn from the arms of its mother amid the most heart-rending shrieks from the mother and the child on the one hand, and the bitter oaths of cruel lashes from the tyrants on the other." And I thought about like how like heartbreaking that must be. And they went on to say that her mother was sold to the highest bidder. And so I bring this up because I think, and Hella, you mentioned it, Ashley, you might have mentioned it as well, I can't recall. But this idea that like during the enslavement of African folks in these Americas, not just in what is now the US, but across the Americas, is this idea of like living in constant fear that their children might be sold away, right? It's like, here's an image of literally like a woman pleading for her kin, for her child, right? That they're literally holding it from its arms and are presumably just, getting ready to sell the baby off. And the idea was like the future reward, and these children would cost lots of money because it's like, all right, I have to upkeep them now, but they will soon be able to pick and till the land. So interestingly, in this context of enslaved children, until the end of the Civil War in the 1860s, it was common for slavers to rip families apart by selling children or the parents to other slave owners, right? And this really came as often punishment, right? If you didn't do things the way that I wanted them done, if I felt like you didn't respect me, it was literally a matter of punishing children, was to rip their families apart. And so I think it's important for us as a group to hold on to that note, right? Like as punishment for not kind of obeying the rules or following the rules, your child was taken away from you and sent somewhere else to live, right? So like, because we're going to come back to that later on in our conversation. So if we think about between 1820 and 1860, approximately 30% of all enslaved children born in the Upper South would have been places like Maryland and DC, and some folks might consider North Carolina, as opposed to the Deep South, Louisiana, Arkansas, Georgia, etc. So folks, the enslaved children born in the Upper South were taken from their families and sold to the Deep South to work in the harshest climates on plantations. And that is an interesting point for folks who are, some folks might be familiar with this idea of this dichotomy between, you know, the Upper South and the Deep South. The idea was that like the folks in the Deep South were the harshest. And so it was the folks living under this constant threat of not wanting to be sold into the Deep South. Like they would often never be heard from again, often killed, right? So you go from living being someone who was enslaved to, you know, maybe you just rode the horse and buggy, and you had a lawyer who was the person who enslaved you. You had the president of the United States that literally enslaved you in Virginia, right? And like, so it might not have been that bad for you, but to go down into Louisiana would almost be an assured early death. So, you know, we talked a little bit about this idea of kind of indentured servitude, slavery, the enslavement of children, and what kind of family separation is like. But I think it's also important to think through what mothering looks like for Black women during this period. And so here I talk a little bit about this idea of like child rearing practices among Black Americans had their roots in traditional customs. Motherhood, however, took on two unique characteristics for enslaved women in the United States. So first, there's this kind of accepted pattern of matrilineal and matrifocal families in traditional African societies. So thinking about like the patriarchy and the role of the mother and being the head of the house and the rearing of children. So many African women rear the children without the help from their fathers. Moreover, the disproportionate number of men taken by slave traders left many women with dependent children to care for, and a greater portion of the work ordinarily completed by men to perform. And then the way that women managed, helped by other women on the plantations, right? So it would be, you know, John, whatever, would be sold somewhere else off the plantation, because a part of the family separation was most kind of folks did not engage in respecting, by folks, I mean white slavers, did not engage in the respecting of marriage between enslaved people, right? So you two might have been enslaved and married each other and even bore children that then bear a profit for your slaver. However, they cared not, and would sell you off in a minute, often as punishment, right? If you didn't do something the way I liked it, now I'm gonna rip you apart. So it begins to develop this pattern of whenever you didn't do anything or something the right way, there became this kind of cycle of punishment is the destruction of family, right? And then that holds true, right, as we move forward into modern context. So interestingly, so we talked about this idea of mothering and how other women would step up. I also talk about this idea of enslaved foster mothers, right? So if you had large plantations or farms, it was common for children to come under the care of one enslaved woman who was designated to feed and watch over them during the day while their parents worked. And so there was a group of enslaved women who would be responsible for the care during the day while everyone else was out in the fields. You just cared for all of the children. And then in other contexts, it was, oh, this child was sold down into the Deep South. Their mother was sold down into the Deep South, or even to a different plantation, but the child remained on the same plantation. So who cared for the children? Obviously not the slaveholder, right? You had the women on the plantation already, because we already talked about it was usually the women who did the child rearing. So now you had women on the plantation who just cared for the children, right? It wasn't that was Susie May's child and she's gone now, so the kid will figure it out. It was, no, as women on the plantation, you cared for all of the children on the plantation. And in some respects, it was literally like your duty to care for the children. And I think it's also important to honor and recognize the women who were wet nurses, and they cared for the children of their slavers, right? And like their job was to nurse the infants and care for the children of the people who had held them captive. And I didn't want to go too much into like this idea of wet nurse, because that's a whole another context, but it's really important to hold. And I know I see someone wants to share a story. I'm going to ask that you hold on to it unless, Aiden, you feel like it's going to move this part of the conversation forward. If you feel like it's important context for this conversation, I'm welcome to it. Okay, he says we can wait. Actually, no, this is a good time to take a break for that conversation. So since we're not going to shift from this idea of kind of the enslavement in caring for children, I think, Aiden, we can start with you to share your story, and then we have other folks who would like to chime in as well. So Aiden, you're on.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to correlate it to like a current situation is, so like I'm originally from New York, and you know, for a while I was up there, you know, I was in the projects, and it's so profound to see how the same essence of that care from slavery was extended even to that space, because you had kids who were in a certain building whose parents were maybe not around, maybe were, you know, doing drugs or just out in the streets, or, you know, lost their lives to, you know, violence, gang violence, or whatever the case may be. But what was so profound was that whole building was a whole sense of community. Like, if your parents or whoever your caregiver wasn't around, there was always somebody who was there to be like, you know, come in, let's have a meal. You need to stay the night, because that sense of, we didn't want to have child protective services come into that building to take, you know, our kids away, or our youth. And so as much as it's demonized, you know, like how people talk about the projects and stuff, it is a replication of that sense of that communal care, to make sure that our, you know, the youth doesn't get put into the system because they know that they don't come back. So yeah, I just wanted to share that because it was a profound correlation of like, this is being done.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. Is there anyone else who'd like to share a thought? And, you know, we're going to get into exactly kind of what you were just sharing in a few moments, Aiden. So is there anyone else who'd like to share, add a comment, thought before we move forward? Okay, cool. So moving forward, so, you know, shifting from this idea of what kind of it was like on kind of the plantation, right? So this idea of, we've already now developed a narrative of what foster mothers were like during this same context, right? So while you had folks on this Orphan Training movement, you also had folks who were enslaved, who were caring for children, as I call them foster mothers, right? They were foster mothers of their time. To now, we talked about in the 30s, moving into the 50s, right? Like, so now we're talking about like post-emancipation. You know, great, you're free, but now we have kind of Black codes and Jim Crow and the legal kind of like discrimination, separation, and torture of Black folks outside of these plantation settings. So if you think about this context of child welfare having started, Black folks were basically all but kind of written in stone, excluded from social support systems. And that's not just talking about foster care, that's things through, you know, aids for families with dependent children, and or AFD, AFDC, which then eventually became TANF, right? Through rules such as father in the home. So they would have these ideas like, if you have a man who was present and provided any support, that counted against you, even if they weren't providing support, but they lived in the home, you couldn't get support. And so it started to develop this idea where it's like, all right, well, I won't have a man live in the house. And so it started to strengthen this idea that Black men were not present. Because during enslavement, you shipped Black men into the Deep South and tore them away from their kids. Post-emancipation, you then had created this paradigm where in order to get social support, you had to be so poor and literally not have a man around at all. And so they would have to create stories and find ways to make sure they were gone, hide from social workers, and literally kind of hide their presence in their children's lives. And so that, for folks who don't know, who aren't super into the technical weeds, child welfare system, vis-a-vis foster care, is funded by social welfare programs, specifically like TANF support. It's like foster care is welfare. And if you have a child in, this is like almost a tangent, but it's important. If you have a child in foster care, a state or county agency can pursue the parents for child support. In the same way, if a mother is on welfare, they can pursue the father then. If they're in foster care, they will still pursue. And so it's important to note that is another kind of part of the system that really is kind of rendering kind of poverty amongst folks, and like instead of caring for children because it's the right thing to do, it's like, yeah, we're still going to come after you for child support, right? So historical and cultural traditions of kinship, like you were just talking about, Aiden, right, really is what sustained Black families in this period where they were excluded from child welfare systems. So you talked about, Aiden, kind of, hey, such and such down the street would care for us. That's what happened, right? In the same way that during the enslavement of Black folks, you had such and such down the road who cared for you. That's the way it worked, kind of when we were excluded from child welfare systems. So, and I call what you talked about, Aiden, this idea of community surveillance. That holds true in this main modern context of like teachers as surveillors, right? Like folks have this idea that teachers are the primary source of reporters for child welfare agencies. So they basically are kind of extensions of the state for surveillance. And so, we already answered this question. It's like, how were kind of Black children protected from abuse and neglect in the absence of formal services? It was the community, right? So, we talk about this idea of kin, whether it be fictive kin, biological kin. They were really about the oversight, right? We all have heard stories from our mothers, our grandmothers, our aunts, our uncles. It's like, oh yeah, if such and such down the block caught you doing X, Y, Z, you were going to get it from them, right? But at the same time, if such and such down the block also saw that you all were struggling and didn't have food to eat, you were going to get food from them. You were always welcome to eat at their house, right? And that's how it worked for Black folks. So it wasn't unusual for children to be raised for a part or all of their lives by aunts or uncles. This still holds true today. And then when relatives lived close together, children were encouraged to go to a neighbor's house after school if their parents weren't home or if their parents were too busy to meet their needs, right? So it's like, it was literally this idea of the entire community was responsible for you. No one more, no one less responsible. And being parents having biological parents in the home didn't get you off the hook from having Aunt Susie down the street also looking after you. So then the question becomes, all right, well, that's the case where it's like they just need a little bit of support. What happens in the case of quote unquote absent parents due to kind of what Professor Roberts was talking about, this idea of incarcerating parents, right? Or, the death of parents, unfortunately. So if you think about the latter decades of the 19th century, which would have been the late 1800s, up until really like the very recent past, it is common practice for Black folks to assume responsibility for the children of relatives who needed a home due to parental death, separation, abandonment, or illness, right? And there was no assistance from kind of state-sanctioned systems. And so I'm sure that folks, even on this call, might have someone in their family who might be caring for an aunt or a niece, a nephew, a baby cousin, or even like a younger, brother or sister, and not necessarily needing the state to be a part of it, right? And that's like the tradition. It's like, all right, great, you need a place to stay, you're more than welcome here. And that's the context through which Black folks really cared for their families and their kin. because we were locked out of foster care systems. I'm not going to read this all verbatim, I promise. But I think it's really important as a context. So I'm going to make sure you all get access to these slides. And you'll have to forgive me because I get so into research and I just start reading and citing and pulling all that stuff. But I think, you know, we know that, like I mentioned, you know, folks are routinely taking in their nieces and nephews when their parents are ill and or deceased. So, right, if my sister needs someone to take care of their kids, you know, do I want to take in additional children? No, 3 is plenty for me. However, if that need arose, I would happily step up to the plate, right? And so really the point of this slide is really to talk about how there's like decades, like literal decades of research looking at how Black folks were really caring for families. So like there's one study I have in here from in the 1930s. There was a study that found that in Georgia, where biological children lived in families with adopted children, and there was no distinction between them. There was also this frequent informal adoption of children by their relatives. So maybe aunt just took you in, and then you're now my son. Your mom can't take care of you. You come to live with me. And women who had no children of their own often raised large families of children that related to them through kinship ties. So, you know, the point really in this context is that Black folks, historically, even not just on the plantation, but there's like documented research as far back as the 1920s that was showing that like Black folks were fostering their families outside of the context of a modern foster care system. And so I think for me, it's really important for us to take that all into account and consideration as we think through, all right, well, what does the real story of foster care mean, right? Like we talked earlier about like who else was there, what was happening to these other folks. These other folks weren't worried about a social safety net to care about for them because Jim Crow laws prevented them from getting services, so we just did it ourselves. Cool. So now that we've kind of talked through these two kind of very different ideas of kind of a narrative of foster care, I'd love for us to break into smaller groups and really just talk through, all right, if someone asks you, kind of give you the 3-minute to 5-minute story of foster care, how would you now describe it?